This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography.
Produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 57, Impasse. The possibility of my rearrest and conviction always hung over me. It was, indeed, more than a possibility when the land was ruled by ordinances and the like, and the Congress itself was an illegal organization. Constituted as the British government was, and constituted as I was, my suppression seemed inevitable. This ever-present prospect influenced my work. I could not settle down to anything, and I was in a hurry to get through as much as possible. And yet I had no desire to invite arrest, and to a large extent I avoided activities which might lead to it. Invitations came to me from many places in the province and outside to undertake a tour. I refused them, for any such speaking tour could only be a raging campaign which would be abruptly ended. There was no halfway house for me then. When I visited any place for some other object, to confer with Gandhiji and the working committee members, I addressed public meetings and spoke freely in Jabalpur. We had a great meeting and a very impressive procession. In Delhi the gathering was one of the biggest I had seen there. Indeed, the very success of these meetings made it clear that the government would not tolerate their frequent repetition. In Delhi, soon after the meeting, there was a very strong rumor of my impending arrest, but I survived and returned to Allahabad, breaking journey at Aligarh to address the Muslim university students there. I disliked the idea of taking part in non-political public activities when the government was trying to crush all effective political work. I found a strong tendency among congressmen to seek shelter from such work by engaging in the most humdrum activities which, though desirable in themselves, had little to do with our struggle. The tendency was natural, but I felt that it should not be encouraged just then. In the middle of October 1933, we had meetings of our UP Congress workers in Allahabad to consider the situation and decide on future work. The Provincial Congress Committee was an illegal body, and as our object was to meet and not just to defy the law, we did not formally convene this committee. But we asked all its members who were outside jail, as well as other selected workers, to come to an informal conference. There was no secrecy about our meetings, though they were private, and we did not know till the last moment whether the government would interfere or not. At these meetings we paid a great deal of attention to the world situation, the great slump, Nazism, communism, etc. We wanted our comrades to see the Indian struggle in relation to what was happening elsewhere. The conference ultimately passed a socialistic resolution defining our objective and expressed itself against the withdrawal of civil disobedience. Everybody knew well enough that there was no chance of widespread civil disobedience, and even individual civil disobedience was likely to peter out soon or continue on a very restricted scale, but a withdrawal made little difference to us as the government offensive and ordinance laws continued. So, more as a gesture than anything else, we decided to continue the formal civil disobedience, but in effect our instructions to our workers were not to go out of their way to invite arrest. They were to carry on their normal work, and if arrest came in the course of that, to accept it with good grace. In particular, they were asked to renew contacts with the rural areas and find out the condition of the peasantry, both as a result of the remissions of rent and government repression. There was no question of a no-rent campaign then. This had been formally withdrawn after the Pune conference, and it was obvious that it could not be revived under the circumstances. This program was a mild and inoffensive one, with nothing patently illegal in it, and yet we knew that it would lead to arrests. As soon as our workers went to the villages, they were arrested and charged, quite wrongly, with preaching a no-rent campaign, which had been made an offence under the ordinance laws, and convicted. It was my intention to go to these rural areas after the arrest of many of my comrades, but other activities claimed my attention, and I postponed my visit till it was too late. Twice during those months, the members of the working committee met together to consider the all India situation. The committee itself was not functioning, not so much because it was an illegal body, but because at Gandhiji's instance after Pune, all Congress committees and offices had been suspended. I happened to occupy a peculiar position, as on coming out of jail I refused to join this self-denying ordinance, and insisted on calling myself the General Secretary of the Congress. But I functioned in the air. There was no proper office, no staff, no acting president, and Gandhiji, though available for consultation, was busy with one of his tremendous all-India tours, this time for Harijan work. We managed to catch him during his tour at Jabalpur and Delhi and held our consultations with working committee members. They served to bring out clearly the differences between various members. There was an impasse and no way out of it agreeable to everybody. Gandhiji was the deciding factor between those who wanted to withdraw civil disobedience and those who were against this. As he was then in favor of the latter course, matters continued as before. The question of contesting elections on behalf of the Congress to the legislatures was sometimes discussed by congressmen, though the working committee members were not much interested in this at the time. It did not arise. It was obviously premature. The reforms were not likely to materialize for another 2 or 3 years at least, and there was then no mention of fresh elections for the Assembly. Personally, I had no theoretical objection to contesting elections, and I felt sure in my mind that when the time came the Congress would have to go in for them. But to raise this question then was only to distract attention. I hoped that the continuance of our struggle would clear up the issues that faced us and prevent the compromising elements from dominating the situation. Meanwhile, I continued sending articles and statements to the press. To some extent, I had to tone down my writings, for they were written with a view to publication, and there was the censor and various laws whose octopus-like tentacles reached far. Even if I was prepared to take risks, the printers, publishers, and editors were not. On the whole, the newspapers were good to me and stretched many a point in my favor. But not always. Sometimes statements and passages were suppressed, and once a whole long article, over which I had taken some pains, never saw the light of day. When I was in Calcutta in January 1934, the editor of one of the leading dailies came to see me. He told me that he had sent one of my statements to the editor-in-chief of all Calcutta newspapers for his opinion, and as the editor-in-chief had disapproved of it, it had not been published. The editor-in-chief was the government press censor for Calcutta. In some of my press interviews and statements, I ventured to criticize forcibly some groups and individuals. This was resented, partly because of the idea, which Gandhiji had helped to spread, that Congress could be attacked without any danger of its hitting back. Gandhiji himself had set an example of this, and in varying degrees leading congressmen had followed his lead, though sometimes this was not so. Usually we stuck to vague and pious phrases, and this gave an opportunity to our critics to get away with their faulty reasoning and opportunist tactics. The real issues were avoided on both sides, and an honest discussion, with occasional parry and thrust, seldom took place, as it does in Western countries, except where fascism prevails. A friend whose opinion I valued wrote to me that she had been a little surprised at the vigor of some of my statements to the press. I was almost becoming cattish. Was this the outcome of frustration of my hopes? I wondered. Partly it was true, for nationally all of us suffer from frustration. Individually also, it must have been true to some extent. Yet I was not very conscious of the feeling because personally I had no sensation of suppression or failure. Ever since Gandhiji came within my ken politically, I learnt one thing at least from him, not to suppress my ideas within me for fear of the consequences. That habit, followed in the political sphere, in other spheres it would be more difficult and dangerous to follow, has often got me into trouble, but it has also brought much satisfaction with it. I think that it is because of this that many of us have escaped real bitterness of heart and the worst kinds of frustration. The knowledge also that large numbers of people think of me with affection is very soothing and is a powerful antidote against defeatism and frustration. The most terrible of all feelings, I imagine, is to be alone, forgotten by others. But even so, How can one escape in this strange, unhappy world a feeling of frustration? How often everything seems to go wrong, and though we carry on, doubts assail us when we see the quality of human material around us. I am afraid I feel anger and resentment often enough at various happenings and developments, and even at persons and groups. And latterly I have begun to resent more and more the drawing-room attitude to life, which ignores vital issues and considers it improper to refer to them, because they happen to touch one's pocket or pet prejudices. With all this resentment and frustration and cattishness, I hope I have not yet lost the gift of laughing at my own and other people's follies. I sometimes wonder at the faith of people in a beneficent providence, how it survives shock after shock, and how disaster itself and disproof of beneficence are considered but tests of the soundness of that faith. Those delightful lines of Gerard Hopkins find an echo in many a heart. Thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend with thee. But, sir, so what I plead is just. Why do sinners' ways prosper? And why must disappointment all I endeavour end? Wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost defeat thwart me? Oh, the sots and thralls of lust, do in spare hours more thrive than I that spend, sir, life upon thy cause. Faith in progress, in a cause, in ideals, in human goodness and human destiny, are they not nearly allied to faith in a providence? If we seek to justify them by reason and logic immediately, we get into difficulties. But something within us clutches to that hope and faith, for deprived of them, life would be a wilderness without an oasis. The effect of my socialist propaganda upset even some of my colleagues of the working committee. They would have put up with me without complaint, as they had done for several years during which I had been carrying on this propaganda, but I was now frightening to some extent the vested interests in the country, and my activities could no longer be called innocuous. I knew that some of my colleagues were no socialists, but I had always thought that, as a member of the Congress Executive, I had perfect freedom to carry on socialist propaganda without committing the Congress to it. The realization that some members of the working committee did not think that I had that freedom came as a surprise. I was putting them in a false position, and they resented it. But what was I to do? I was not going to give up what I considered the most important part of my work. I would much rather resign from the working committee if there was a conflict between the two. But how could I resign when the committee was illegal and was not even functioning properly? This difficulty faced me again later. I think it was towards the end of December when Gandhiji wrote to me from Madras. He sent me a cutting from the Madras Mail containing an interview he had given. The interviewer had asked him about me, and he had replied almost apologizing for my activities and expressing his faith in my rectitude. I would not commit the Congress to these novel ways. I did not particularly fancy this reference to me, but what upset me much more was Gandhiji's defense, further on in the interview, of the big zamindari system. He seemed to think that this was a very desirable part of rural and national economy. This was a great surprise to me, for the big zamindaris and talukas have very few defenders today. All over the world they have been broken up, and even in India most people recognize that they cannot last long. Even talukdars and zamindars would welcome an end of the system provided, of course, they got sufficient compensation therefore. Footnote: Mr. P. N. Tagore, chairman of the Reception Committee of the All Bengal Landholders Conference, said in his address on December 23, 1934, "Personally, I will not regret the day when lands of the zamindars are nationalized, as has been done in Ireland, upon payment of adequate compensation to the landlord." End of footnote. The system is indeed sinking of its own weight, and yet Gandhiji was in favour of it and talked of trusteeship and the like. How very different was his outlook from mine, I thought again, and I wondered how far I could cooperate with him in future. Must I continue to remain in the working committee? There was no way out just then, and a few weeks later the question became irrelevant because of my return to prison. My domestic affairs took up a lot of my time. My mother's health continued to improve, but very slowly. She was still bedridden, but she seemed to be out of danger. I turned to my financial affairs, which had been long neglected and were in a muddle. We had been spending much more than we could afford, and there seemed to be no obvious way of reducing our expenditure. I was not particularly anxious about making both ends meet. Almost, I looked forward to the time when I would have no money left. Money and possessions are useful enough in the modern world, but often they become a burden for one who wants to go on a long journey. It is very difficult for moneyed people to take part in undertakings which involve risk. They are always afraid of losing their goods and chattels. What is the good of money or property if the government can take possession of it when it chooses, or even confiscate it? So I almost wished to get rid of what little I had. Our needs were few, and I felt confident of my ability to earn enough. My chief concern was that my mother, in the evening of her life, should not suffer discomforts or any marked lowering of the standard of living. I was also anxious that my daughter's education should not be interfered with, and this, according to my thinking, involved a stay in Europe. Apart from this, neither my wife nor I had any special need for money, or so we thought, being unused to the real lack of it. I am quite sure that when the time comes when we lack money, we shall not be happy about it. One extravagance which I have kept up will be hard to give up, and this is the buying of books. To improve the immediate financial situation, we decided to sell off my wife's jewelry, the silver and other similar articles that we possessed, as well as many cartloads of odds and ends. Kamla did not like the idea of parting with her jewelry, although she had not worn any of it for a dozen years and it had lain in the bank. But she had looked forward to handing it on to our daughter. It was January 1934. Continued arrests of our workers in the villages of the Allahabad district, although innocently employed, seemed to demand that we should follow in their steps and visit those villages. Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, our very effective secretary of the UP Provincial Congress Committee, was also under arrest. January 26th, Independence Day, was coming and it could not be ignored. Despite ordinances and prohibitions, it had been regularly observed in various parts of the country every year since 1930. But who was to give the lead? And what was the lead to be? There was no one besides me who was functioning, even in theory, as an official of the All India Congress. I consulted some friends, and almost all agreed that something should be done, but there was no agreement as to what this something should be. I found a general tendency to avoid any action which might lead to arrests on a large scale. Eventually I issued a brief appeal for the appropriate celebration of Independence Day, the manner of doing so to be decided by each local area for itself. In Allahabad, we planned a fairly widespread celebration all over the district. We felt that the organizers of this Independence Day celebration would be arrested on that day. Before I went back to prison again, I wanted to pay a visit to Bengal. This was partly to meet old colleagues there, but really it was to be a gesture in the nature of tribute to the people of Bengal for their extraordinary sufferings during the past few years. I knew very well that I could do nothing to help them. Sympathy and fellow feeling did not go far, and yet they were very welcome, and Bengal was especially suffering from a sense of isolation, of being deserted by the rest of India in her hour of need. That feeling was not justified, but nevertheless it was there. I had also to go to Calcutta with Kamla to consult our doctors there about her treatment. She had been far from well, but we had both tried to overlook this to some extent and postpone recourse to a treatment which might involve a long stay in Calcutta or elsewhere. We wanted to be together as much as possible during my brief period outside prison. After I went back to jail, I thought, she would have plenty of time for doctors and treatment. Now that arrest seemed near, I decided to have these consultations at least in my presence in Calcutta. The rest could be attended to later. So we decided to go to Calcutta, Kamla and I, on January 15th. We wanted to return in good time for our Independence Day meetings. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 Earthquake. It was the afternoon of the 15th January, 1934. I was standing in the veranda of our house in Allahabad addressing a group of peasants. The annual Magh Mela had begun, and we had crowds of visitors all day. Suddenly I became unsteady on my feet and could hardly keep my balance. I clung onto a column nearby. Doors started banging, and a rumbling noise came from the adjoining Swaraj Bhavan, where many of the tiles were sliding down the roof. Being unaccustomed to earthquakes, I did not know at first what was happening, but I soon realized it. I was rather amused and interested at this novel experience, and I continued my talk to the peasants and began telling them about the earthquake. My old aunt shouted out to me from some distance to run out of the building. The idea struck me as absurd. I did not take the earthquake seriously, and in any event I was not going to leave my bedridden mother upstairs, and my wife, who was probably packing, also upstairs, and seek safety for myself. For what seemed quite an appreciable time the shocks continued and then passed off. They provided a few minutes' conversation and soon were almost forgotten. We did not know then, nor could we guess, what those 2 or 3 minutes had meant to millions in Bihar and elsewhere. That evening Kamla and I left for Calcutta, and all unknowing, we were carried by our train that night through the southern earthquake area. The next day there was little news in Calcutta about the disaster. The day after, bits of news began to come in. On the third day we began to have a faint notion of the calamity. We busied ourselves with our Calcutta program. There were plenty of doctors to be seen repeatedly, and it was finally decided that Kamla was to come back to Calcutta for treatment a month or 2 later. Then there were friends and Congress colleagues whom we had not met for a long time. I had a terrible sense of oppression all the time. People seemed to be afraid of doing almost anything lest trouble should come to them. They had gone through much. Newspapers were more cautious than anywhere else in India. There was also, as elsewhere in India, doubt and confusion about future work. It was indeed this doubt, and not so much fear, that prevented any effective political activity. There were fascist tendencies much in evidence, and socialist and communist tendencies, all rather vague and running into each other. It was difficult to draw hard and fast lines between these groups. I had neither the time nor the opportunity to find out much about the terrorist movement, which was receiving a great deal of attention and advertisement from official sources. As far as I could gather, it had no political significance whatever, and the old members of the terrorist groups had no faith left in it. They were beginning to think on different lines. Resentment at government action in Bengal had, however, led individuals here and there to break loose and indulge in a kind of feud. Indeed, on either side this idea of a feud seemed to be dominant. On the side of the individual terrorists, this was obvious enough. On the side of the state also, the attitude was far more that of carrying on a feud, with occasional reprisals, than of calmly grappling with an anti-social occurrence and suppressing it. Any government faced by terroristic acts is bound to combat them and try to suppress them. But serene control is more becoming in a government than excessive action applied indiscriminately to guilty and innocent alike, and chiefly to the latter because they are sure to be more numerous. Perhaps it is not easy to remain calm and collected in the face of such a threat. Terroristic acts were becoming rare, but the possibility of them was ever present, and this was enough to upset the composure of those who had to deal with them. Such acts, it is patent enough, are not a disease, but the symptoms of a disease. It is futile to treat the symptoms and not the disease itself. I believe that a number of young men and women who are supposed to have dealings with terrorists are really attracted by the glamour of secret work. Secrecy and risk have always an appeal for the adventurous type of youth. The desire to be in the know, to find out what all this shouting is about and who are these men behind the scenes. It is the call of the detective story. These people have no intention of doing anything, certainly not a terroristic act, but their mere association with suspects in the eyes of the police is enough to make them suspect also. Soon they are likely to find themselves in the ranks of the détenus or in an internment camp if a worse fate does not await them. Law and order, we are told, are among the proud achievements of British rule in India. My own instincts are entirely in favor of them. I like discipline in life, and dislike anarchy and disorder and inefficiency. But bitter experience has made me doubt the value of the law and order that states and governments impose on a people. Sometimes the price one pays for them is excessive, and the law is but the will of the dominant faction, and the order is the reflex of an all-pervading fear. Sometimes, indeed, the so-called law and order might be more justly called the absence of law and order. Any achievement that is based on widespread fear can hardly be a desirable one, and an order that has for its basis the coercive apparatus of the state and cannot exist without it is more like a military occupation than civil rule. I find in the Rajtarangini, the 1,000-year-old Kashmiri historic epic of the poet Kalhan, that the phrase which is repeatedly used in the sense of law and order, something that it was the duty of the ruler and the state to preserve, is dharma and abhay, righteousness and absence of fear. Law was something more than mere law, and order was the fearlessness of the people. How much more desirable is this idea of inculcating fearlessness than of enforcing order on a frightened populace? We spent 3.5 days in Calcutta, and during this period I addressed 3 public meetings. As I had done before in Calcutta, I condemned and argued against terroristic acts, and then I passed on to the methods that the government had adopted in Bengal. I spoke from a full heart, for I had been greatly moved by accounts of occurrences in the province. What pained me most was the manner in which human dignity had been outraged by indiscriminate suppression of whole populations. The political problem, urgent as it was, took second place before this human problem. These 3 speeches of mine formed the 3 counts against me in my subsequent trial in Calcutta, and my present sentence is due to them. From Calcutta we went to Shantiniketan to pay a visit to the poet Rabindranath Tagore. It was always a joy to meet him, and having come so near, we did not wish to miss him. I had been to Shantiniketan twice before. It was Kamla's first visit, and she had come especially to see the place, as we were thinking of sending our daughter there. Indira was going to appear for her matriculation soon afterwards, and the problem of her future education was troubling us. I was wholly against her joining the regular official or semi-official universities, for I disliked them. The whole atmosphere that envelops them is official, oppressive, and authoritarian. They have no doubt produced fine men and women in the past, and they will continue to do so. But these few exceptions cannot save the universities from the charge of suppressing and deadening the fine instincts of youth. Shantiniketan offered an escape from this dead hand, and so we fixed upon it, although in some ways it was not so up-to-date and well-equipped as the other universities. On our way back, we stopped at Patna to discuss with Rajendra Babu the problem of earthquake relief. He had just been discharged from prison and, inevitably, he had taken the lead in unofficial relief work. Our arrival was unexpected, for none of our telegrams had been delivered. The house where we intended staying with Kamla's brother was in ruins. It was a big double-storied brick structure. So, like many others, we lived in the open. The next day, I paid a visit to Muzaffarpur. It was exactly 7 days after the earthquake, and little had so far been done to remove the debris, except from some of the main streets. As these streets were cleaned, corpses were being discovered, some in curiously expressive attitudes, as if trying to ward off a falling wall or roof. The ruins were an impressive and terrifying sight. The survivors were thoroughly shaken up and cowed by their nerve-wracking experiences. Returning to Allahabad, collections of funds and materials were immediately organized, and all of us, of the Congress or out of it, took this up in earnest. Some of my colleagues were of opinion that because of the earthquake, the Independence Day celebration should be called off. But other colleagues and I saw no reason why even an earthquake should interfere with our program. So, on the 26th January, we had a large number of meetings in the villages of Allahabad district and a meeting in the city, and we met with greater success than we had anticipated. Most people expected police interference and arrests, and on a minor scale there was some interference. But much to our surprise, we survived the meeting. In some of our villages and in some other cities, arrests were made. Soon after returning from Bihar, I issued a statement about the earthquake, ending up with an appeal for funds. In this statement, I criticized the inactivity of the Bihar government during the first few days after the earthquake. It was not my intention to criticize the officials in the earthquake areas, for they had had to deal with a very difficult situation which would have tried the stoutest nerves, and I was sorry that some of my words were capable of this interpretation. But I did feel strongly that the headquarters of the Bihar government had not shown great competence to begin with, especially in the matter of removal of debris, which might have saved lives. Thousands of people were killed in Munger city alone, and 3 weeks later I saw a vast quantity of debris still lying untouched, although a few miles away at Jamalpur there was a large colony of many thousands of railway workers who could have been utilized for this purpose within a few hours of the catastrophe. Living people were unearthed even 12 days after the earthquake. The government had taken immediate steps to protect property, but they had not been so expeditious in trying to rescue people who lay buried. The municipalities in these areas were not functioning. I think my criticism was justified, and I found later that the great majority of people in the earthquake areas agreed with it. But whether it was justified or not, it was honestly made, not with the intention of blaming the government, but of speeding them up. No one accused them of any deliberate sins of commission or omission in this respect. It was a novel and overpowering situation, and errors were excusable. The Bihar government, so far as I know, for I have been in jail, later on worked with energy and competence to repair the ravages of the earthquake. But my criticism was resented, and soon afterwards a few people in Bihar came out with a general testimonial in favor of the government as a kind of counterblast. The earthquake and its demands became almost a secondary matter. More important was the fact that the government had been criticized, and it must be defended by its loyal subjects. This was an interesting instance of a widespread phenomenon in India, the dislike of criticism of the government, which is a commonplace in Western countries. It is the military mentality which cannot tolerate criticism. Like the king, the British government in India and all of its superior officials can do no wrong. To hint at any such thing is lèse-majesté. The curious part of it is that a charge of inefficiency and incompetence is resented far more than an accusation of harsh government or tyranny. The latter might indeed land the person making it in prison, but the government is used to it and does not really mind it. After all, in a way, it might almost be considered a compliment to an imperial race. But to be called inefficient and wanting in nerve hurts, for this strikes at the root of their self-esteem. It disturbs the messianic delusions of the English officials in India. They are like the Anglican bishop who was prepared to put up meekly with a charge of unchristian behavior, but who resented and hit out when someone called him foolish and incompetent. There is a general belief among Englishmen, frequently asserted as if it was an incontrovertible maxim, that a change of government in India, involving a reduction or elimination of British influence, would result in a much worse and more inefficient government. Holding this belief, but generous in their enthusiasm, radicals and Englishmen of advanced views plead that good government is no substitute for self-government, and if Indians want to go to the dogs, they should be permitted to do so. I do not know what will happen to India when British influence is eliminated. Much depends on how the British withdraw and who is in control in India then, and on a host of other considerations, national and international. I can quite conceive a state of affairs, established with the help of the British, which will be more inefficient and generally worse than anything that we can have today, for it will have all the vices of the present system without its virtues. I can conceive more readily still a different state of affairs, which from the point of view of the Indian people will be far more efficient and beneficial than anything we have today. It is possible that the coercive apparatus of the state may not be so efficient, and the administrative apparatus not quite so shiny, but there will be greater efficiency in production, consumption, and the activities which go to raise the physical, the spiritual, and cultural standards of the masses. I believe that self-government is good for any country, but I am not prepared to accept even self-government at the cost of real good government. Self-government, if it is to justify itself, must stand ultimately for better government for the masses. It is because I believe that the British government in India, whatever its claims in the past may have been, is incapable of providing good government and rising standards for the masses today, that I feel that it has outlived its utility, such as it was, in India. The only real justification for Indian freedom is the promise of better government, of a higher standard for the masses, of industrial and cultural growth, and of the removal of the atmosphere of fear and suppression that foreign imperialist rule invariably brings in its train. The British government and the ICS, though they may be strong enough to impose their will on India, are not efficient or competent enough to solve India's problems of today, and even less of the future, because their foundations and assumption are all wrong and they have lost touch with reality. A government or ruling class which is not competent enough, or which represents a passing order, cannot long continue even to impose their will. The Allahabad Earthquake Relief Committee deputed me to visit the areas affected by the earthquake and to report on the methods of relief work adopted there. I went immediately, alone, and for 10 days I wandered about those torn and ruined territories. It was a very strenuous tour, and I had little sleep during those days. From 5 in the morning till almost midnight we were up and about, motoring over the cracked and crumpled up roads, or going by little boats where the bridges had collapsed and the roads were under water owing to a change in level. The towns were impressive enough with their extensive ruins, and their roads torn up and twisted sometimes as by a giant hand, or raised high above the plinth of the houses on either side. Out of huge cracks in these roads water and sand had gushed out and swept away men and cattle. More even than these towns, the plains of North Bihar, the Garden of Bihar they used to be called, had desolation and destruction stamped upon them. Mile upon mile of sand, and large sheets of water, and huge cracks and vast numbers of little craters out of which this sand and water had come. Some British officers who flew over this area said that it bore some resemblance to the battlefields of northern France in wartime and soon after. It must have been a terrible experience. The earthquake began with strong side-to-side movements which knocked down any person who was standing. Then there were up and down movements, and a vast rumbling and reverberating noise, as of an artillery bombardment, or 100 airplanes in the sky, and waters gushed out in innumerable places out of huge fissures and craters, and rose to about 10 or 12 feet. All this probably lasted for 3 minutes or a little more, and then it died down, but those 3 minutes were terrible enough. It is not surprising that many persons who saw this happen imagined that this was the end of the world. In the cities there was a noise of falling houses, and a rushing of waters, and an atmosphere full of dust which made it impossible to see even a few yards. In the rural areas there was not much dust, and one could see a little farther, but there were no calm-eyed spectators about. Those who survived lay flat on the ground, or rolled about in an agony of terror. A little boy of 12 was dug out, I think in Muzaffarpur, alive 10 days after the earthquake. He was greatly surprised. He had imagined, when he was knocked down and imprisoned by falling material, that the world had ended and he was the solitary survivor. In Muzaffarpur also, at the exact moment of the earthquake, when houses were collapsing and hundreds were dying all round, a baby girl was born. The inexperienced young parents did not know what to do and were distraught. I learned, however, that both the mother and the baby survived and were flourishing. In honor of the earthquake, the baby was named Kompo Devi. The city of Munger was the last place in our tour. We had wandered a good deal and gone almost up to the frontier of Nepal, and we had seen many harrowing sights. We had become used to ruins and destruction on a vast scale. And yet when we saw Munger and the absolute destruction of this rich city, we gasped and shivered at the horror of it. I can never forget that terrible sight. All over the earthquake areas there was a very painful absence of self-help among the residents, both in the cities and villages. Probably the middle classes in the cities were the worst offenders in this respect. They all waited for somebody to take action and help them, either the government or the non-official relief agencies. Others who offered their services thought that work meant ordering people about. Part of this feeling of helplessness was no doubt due to the nervous collapse brought about by the terror of the earthquake, and it must have gradually lessened. In marked contrast with this was the energy and capacity of the large numbers of relief workers who poured in from other parts of Bihar and other provinces. It was wonderful to see the spirit of efficient service of these young men and women, and in spite of the fact that a host of separate relief organizations were working, there was a great deal of cooperation between them. In Munger, I indulged in a theatrical gesture to give a push to the self-help movement for digging and removing the debris. I did so with some hesitation, but it turned out to be a success. All the leaders of the relief organizations went out with spades and baskets and did a good day's digging, and we brought out the corpse of a little girl. I left Munger that day, but the digging went on and many local people took it up with very good results. Of all the non-official relief organizations, the Central Relief Committee, of which Rajendra Prasad was the head, was far the most important. This was by no means a purely Congress organization, and it developed into an all-India body representing various groups and the donors. It had, however, the great advantage of having the Congress organization in the rural areas at its disposal. In no province in India, except Gujarat and some districts of the United Provinces, were the Congress workers more in touch with the peasants. In fact, the workers themselves came largely from the peasantry. Bihar is preeminently the peasant province of India, and even its middle classes are closely allied to the peasantry. Sometimes when, as Congress Secretary, I went to inspect the Bihar Provincial Congress Committee's office, I criticized in vigorous language what I considered was their inefficiency and general slackness in keeping office. There was a tendency to sit rather than stand, to lie down rather than sit. The office was one of the barest I had seen, for they would try to carry on without many of the usual office accessories. Yet, in spite of my criticism of the office, I knew well that from the Congress point of view, the province was one of the most earnest and devoted in the country. Congress made no show there, but it had the solid backing of the peasantry. Even in the All India Congress Committee, the Bihar members seldom took up an aggressive attitude in any matter. They seemed to be a little surprised at finding themselves there. But in both the civil disobedience movements, Bihar put up a splendid record. Even in the subsequent individual civil disobedience it did well. The Relief Committee availed itself of this fine organization to reach the peasantry. In the rural areas, no other agency, not even the government, could be so helpful. And the head of both the Relief Committee and the Bihar Congress organization was Rajendra Babu, the unquestioned leader of Bihar. Looking like a peasant, a typical son of the soil of Bihar, he is not impressive at first sight till one notices his keen, frank eyes and his earnest look. One does not forget that look or those eyes, for through them truth looks at you, and there is no doubting them. Peasant-like, he is perhaps a little limited in outlook, somewhat unsophisticated from the point of view of the modern world, but his outstanding ability, his perfect straightness, his energy, and his devotion to the cause of Indian freedom are qualities which have made him loved not only in his own province but throughout India. No one in any province in India occupies quite that universally acknowledged position of leadership as Rajendra Babu does in Bihar. Few others, if any, can be said to have imbibed more thoroughly the real message of Gandhiji. It was fortunate that a man like him was available for the leadership of the relief work in Bihar, and it was faith in him that drew a vast sum of money from all over India. Weak in health, he threw himself into the work of relief. He overworked himself, for he became the center of all activity and everybody turned to him for advice. During my tour in the earthquake areas, or just before going there, I read with a great shock Gandhiji's statement to the effect that the earthquake had been a punishment for the sin of untouchability. This was a staggering remark, and I welcomed and wholly agreed with Rabindranath Tagore's answer to it. Anything more opposed to the scientific outlook it would be difficult to imagine. Perhaps even science will not be absolutely dogmatic today about the effect of emotional states and psychic occurrences on matter. A mental shock may result in indigestion or something worse to the person concerned. But to suggest that a human custom or failing had its reactions on the movements of the earth's crust is an astounding thing. The idea of sin and divine wrath and man's relative importance in the affairs of the universe, they take us back a few hundred years when the Inquisition flourished in Europe and burned Giordano Bruno for his scientific heresy and sent many a witch to the stake. Even in the 18th century in America, leading Boston, divines attributed earthquakes in Massachusetts to the impiety of lightning rods. And if the earthquake was a divine punishment for sin, how are we to discover for which sin we are being punished? For alas, we have many sins to atone for. Each person can have his pet explanation. We may have been punished for submitting to alien domination, or for putting up with an unjust social system. The Maharaja of Darbhanga, the owner of enormous estates, was, financially, one of the major sufferers from the earthquake. We might as well say that this was a judgment on the zamindari system. That would be nearer the mark than to suggest that the more or less innocent people of Bihar were being made to suffer vicariously for the sins of untouchability of the people of South India. Why did not the earthquake visit the land of untouchability itself? Or the British government might call the calamity a divine punishment for civil disobedience, for, as a matter of fact, North Bihar, which suffered most from the earthquake, took a leading part in the freedom movement. We can go on speculating indefinitely in this manner. And then, of course, the question arises why we should interfere with the workings of Providence or try to lessen the effect of its divine decrees by our humane efforts. And we begin to wonder why Providence has played this cruel joke on us, to make us full of imperfections, to surround us with snares and pitfalls, to create a miserable and cruel world, to make the tiger and the lamb, and then to punish us. When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, dare he laugh his work to see, dare he who made the lamb make thee? On my last night in Patna, I sat up till very late with many friends and comrades who had gathered there from various provinces to offer their services for relief work. The UP was well represented and some of our chosen men were there. We discussed a problem that was troubling us. How far must we allow ourselves to be involved in earthquake relief? That meant, to that extent at least, a withdrawal from political work. Relief work was very exacting and we could not take it up casually. Absorption in it might well involve a long period of absence from the active political sphere, and that was bound to have a bad effect politically on our province. Although there were many in the Congress fold, the people who make a difference were always limited in number and could ill be spared. And yet the call of the earthquake could not be ignored. For my part, I had no intention of devoting myself exclusively to relief work. I felt that there would be no lack of people for that. There were few for more risky activities. So we talked till far into the night. We discussed the last Independence Day and how some of our colleagues had been arrested then while we had escaped. I told them laughingly that I had discovered the secret of militant politics with perfect safety. I got back home in Allahabad on February 11th, dead tired after my tour. 10 strenuous days had made me look ghastly, and my people were surprised at my appearance. I tried to begin writing my report of the tour for the Allahabad Relief Committee, but sleep overcame me. I spent at least 12 hours out of the next 24 in sleep. Next day, in the late afternoon, Kamla and I had finished tea, and Purushottam Das Tandon had just then joined us. We were standing in the veranda when a car drove up and a police officer alighted. I knew immediately that my time had come. I went up to him and said, "बहुत दिनों से आपका इंतज़ार था. I have been waiting for you for a long time." He was a little apologetic and said that he was not to blame. The warrant was from Calcutta. 5 months and 13 days I had been out, and now I went back again to seclusion and loneliness. But the real burden was not mine. It had to be shouldered, as always, by the women folk, by my ailing mother, my wife, my sister. End of chapter 58.